Welcome, dear listener, to this evening's audiobook. This reading is brought to you by Sleepy Sounds. Tonight, we will be reading a collection of short ghost stories as written by various authors. So, as the gentle sound of the soft rain begins to fall, let us begin our eerie journey together. Mrs. Davenport's Ghost by Frederick P. Schrader. Dear readers, do you agree with Hamlet? Do you believe that there is more between heaven and earth than we dream of in our philosophy? Does it seem possible to you that Eliphas Levi conjured up the shade of Apollonius of Tyana, the prophet of the Magi, in a London hotel, and that the great sage, William Crookes, drank his tea at breakfast several days a week, for months in succession, in the society of the materialized spirit of a young lady, attired in white linen, with a feather turban on her head? Do not laugh. Panic would seize you in the presence even of a turbaned spirit, and the grotesque spectacle would but intensify your terror. As for me, I did not laugh last night on reading an account in a New York newspaper of a criminal trial that will probably terminate in the death penalty of the accused. It is a sad case. I shudder as I transcribe the records of the trial from the testimony of the hotel waiter, who heard the conversation of the two Confederates through a keyhole, and of 40 thoroughly credible witnesses who testified to the same facts. What would be my feelings if I had seen the beautiful victim with the gaping wound in her breast, into which she dipped her finger to mark the brow of her murderer? About 3 o'clock on the afternoon of February 3rd, Professor Davenport and Miss Ida Southshot, a very pale and delicate young girl who had submitted to the tests of Professor Davenport for a number of years, were finishing their dinner in their room in the second story of a New York hotel. Professor Benjamin Davenport was a celebrity, but it was said that he owed his fame to somewhat questionable means. The leading spiritualists did not repose the confidence in him that manifestly marked their regard for William Crookes or Daniel Douglas Home. Greedy and unscrupulous mediums, the author of Spiritualism in America thinks, are to blame for the most bitter attacks to which our cause has been exposed. When the materializations do not take place as quickly as circumstances require, they resort to trickery and fraud to extricate themselves from a dilemma. Professor Benjamin Davenport belonged to these versatile mediums. Aside from this, queer stories were afloat about him. He was secretly accused of highway robbery in South America, cheating at cards in the gambling houses of San Francisco, and the over-hasty use of firearms toward persons who had never offended him. It was said almost openly that the professor's wife had died from abuse and grief at his infidelity. But in spite of these annoying rumors, Mr. Davenport, by virtue of his skill as a fraud and fakir, continued to exercise a great deal of influence upon certain plain and simple-minded folks, whom it was impossible to convince that they had not touched the materialized spirits of their brothers, mothers, or sisters through the agency of his wonderful power. His professional success received material accession from his swarthy, Mephisto-like countenance, his deep, fiery eyes, his large, curved nose, the cynical expression of his mouth, and the lofty, almost prophetic tone of his words. When the waiter had made his last visit, he did not go far. The following conversation took place in the room. "There is to be a séance this evening at the residence of Mrs. Harding," began the medium. "Quite a number of influential people will be there, and 2 or 3 millionaires. Conceal under your skirt the blonde woman's wig and the white material in which the spirits usually make their appearance. Very well, replied Ida Souchot in a resigned tone. The waiter heard her pace the room. After a pause, she asked, "Whose spirit are you going to control this evening, Benjamin?" The waiter heard a loud, brutal laugh, and the chair groaning beneath the weight of the demonstrative professor. "Guess." "How should I know?" she asked. "I am going to conjure up the spirit of my dead wife." And another burst of laughter issued from the room, full of sinister levity. A cry of terror burst from Ida's lips. A muffled sound indicated to the eavesdropper at the door that she was dragging herself to the feet of the professor. "Benjamin, Benjamin, don't do it," she sobbed. "Why not? They say I broke Mrs. Davenport's heart. The story is damaging my reputation, but it will be forgotten if her spirit should address me in terms of endearment from the other shore in the presence of numerous witnesses. For you will speak to me tenderly, will you not, Ida? No, no, you shall not do it. You shall not think of it. Listen to me, for God's sake. During the 4 years that I have been with you, I have obeyed you faithfully and suffered patiently. I have lied and deceived, like you. I learned to imitate the sleep and symptoms of clairvoyance. Tell me, did I ever refuse to serve you, or utter a word of complaint, even when my shoulders bent with the weight of my burden, when you pierced the flesh of my arms with knitting needles? Worse than all this, I imitated distant voices behind curtains and made mothers and wives believe that their sons and husbands had come from a better world to communicate with them. How often have I performed the most dangerous feats in parlors with the lamps turned low? Clothed in a shroud or white muslin, I essayed to represent supernatural forms, whom tear-dimmed eyes recognized as those of departed dear ones. You do not know what I suffered at this unhallowed work. You scoff at the mysteries of eternity. I suffer the torments of an impending retribution. My God, if sometime the dead whom I counterfeit should rise up before me with uplifted arms and dreadful imprecations. This constant terror has injured my heart. It will kill me. I am consumed by fever. Look how emaciated, how worn out and downcast I am. But I am under your control. Do as you like with me. I am in your power, and I want it to be so. Have I ever complained? But do not force me to do this thing, Benjamin. Have pity on me for what I have done for you in the past, for what I am suffering. Do not attempt this mummery. Do not compel me to play the role of your dead wife, who was so tender and beautiful. Oh, what put that thought into your mind? Spare me, Benjamin, I implore you. The professor did not laugh again. Amid the confusion of upturned articles of furniture, the eavesdropper distinguished the sound of a skull striking the floor. He concluded that Professor Davenport had knocked Miss Ida down with a blow of his fist, or had kicked her as she approached him. But the waiter did not enter the room, as no one rang for him. That evening, 40 persons were assembled in Mrs. Joanne Harding's parlor, staring at the curtain where a spirit form was in process of materializing. One dark lantern in a corner of the room contributed the light that emphasized the darkness rather than relieved it. The room was pervaded by profound silence, save the quickened, suppressed breathing of the spectators. The fire in the grate cast mysterious rays of light, resembling fugitive spirits, upon the objects around, almost indistinguishable in the semi-gloom. Professor Davenport was at his best this evening. The The spirit world obeyed him without hesitation, like their lawful master. He was the mighty Prince of Souls. Hands that had no arms were seen picking flowers from the vases. The touch of an invisible spirit conjured sweet melodies from the keys of the piano. The furniture responded by intelligent rappings to the most unanticipated questions. The professor himself elevated his form in symbolical distortions from the floor to an altitude of 3 feet, indicated by Mrs. Harding, and remained suspended in the air for a quarter of an hour, holding live coals in his hands. But the most interesting, as well as the most conclusive test, was to be the materialization of the spirit of Mrs. Arabella Davenport, which the professor had promised at the beginning of the séance. "The hour has come," exclaimed the medium, and while the hearts of all throbbed with anxious suspense, and their eyes distended with painful expectancy of the promised materialization, Benjamin Davenport stood before the curtain. In the twilight, the tall man with the disheveled hair and demon look was really terrible and handsome. "Appear, Arabella," he exclaimed in a commanding voice, with gestures of the Nazarene at the sepulchre of Lazarus. "All are waiting." Suddenly a cry burst from behind the curtain, a piercing, shuddering, horrible shriek, the shriek of an expiring soul. The spectators trembled. Mrs. Harding almost fainted. The medium himself appeared surprised. But Benjamin recovered his composure on seeing the curtain move and admit the spirit. The apparition was that of a young woman with long blonde tresses. She was beautiful and pale, clad in some light, whitish material. Her breast was bare, and on the left side appeared a bleeding wound in which trembled a knife. The spectators arose and retreated, pushing their chairs to the wall. Those who chanced to look at the medium noticed that a deathly pallor had overspread his face, and that he was cowering and trembling. But the young woman, Mrs. Arabella, the real one, whom he so well remembered, she had come in response to his summons, and advanced in a direct line toward Benjamin, who in terror covered his eyes to shut out the ghastly sight, and with a cry fled behind the furniture. But she dipped the finger of her thin hand into the blood from her wound, and traced it across the brow of the unconscious medium, the while repeating, in a slow, monotonous tone that sounded like the echo of a wail, again and again, "You are my murderer. You are my murderer." And while he was rolling and tossing in deadly terror on the floor, they turned up the lights. The spirit had vanished. But in the communicating room, behind the curtain, they found the body of poor Miss Ida Souchot, with horribly distorted features. A physician who was present pronounced it heartstroke. And that is the reason that Professor Benjamin Davenport appeared alone in a New York courtroom to answer to the charge of having murdered his wife 4 years ago in San Francisco. The end. The phantom woman. He took an all-possessing, burning fancy to her from the first. She was neither young nor pretty, so far as he could see, but she was wrapped round with mystery. That was the key of it all. She was noticeable in spite of herself. Her face at the window, sunset after sunset. Her eyes, gazing out mournfully through the dusty panes, hypnotized the lawyer. He saw her through the twilight, night after night, and he grew at length to wait through the days, in a feverish waiting for dusk. And that one look at an unknown woman. She was always at the same window on the ground floor, sitting doing nothing. She looked beyond, so the infatuated solicitor fancied, at him. Once, he even thought that he detected the ghost of a friendly smile on her lips. Their eyes always met with a mute desire to make acquaintance. This romance went on for a couple of months. Gilbert Dent assured himself that nothing in this life can possibly remain stationary, and he cudgeled his brain for a respectable manner of introducing himself to his idol. He had hardly arrived at this point when he received a shock. There came an evening when she was not at the window. Next morning, he walked down Wood Lane on his way to the office. He always went by train, but he felt a strong disinclination to go through another day without a sight of her. His heart began to beat like a schoolgirl's as he drew near the house. If she should be at the window. He was almost disposed to take his courage in his hand and call on her, and, yes, even, tell her, in a quick burst, that she had mysteriously become all the world to him. He could see nothing ridiculous in this course. The possibility of her being married, or having family ties of any sort, had simply never occurred to him. However, she was not at the window. What was more, there was a sinister silence, a sort of breathlessness about the whole place. It was a very hot morning in late August. He looked a long time, but no face came, and no movement stirred the house. He went his way, walking like a man who has been heavily knocked on the brow and sees stars still. That afternoon, he left the office early, and in less than an hour stood at the gate again. The window was blank. He pushed the gate back. It hung on one hinge, and walked up the drive to the door. There were 5 steps leading up to it. At the foot, he wheeled aside sharply to the window. He had a sick dread of looking through the small panes. Why, he could not have told. When at last he found courage to look, he saw that there was a small round table set just under the window. A work table to all appearance. One of those things with lots of little compartments all round, and a lid in the middle, which shut over a well-like cavity for holding pieces of needlework. He remembered that his mother had one, 30 years before. Round the edge of the table was gripped a small, delicate hand. Gilbert Dent's eyes ran from this bloodless hand and slim wrist to a shoulder under a coarse stuff bodice, to a rather wasted throat, which was bare and flung back. So, this was the end, before the beginning. He saw her. She was dead, twisted on the floor with a ghastly face, turned up toward the ceiling, and stiff fingers caught in desperation round the work table. He stumbled away along the path and into the lane. For a long time, he could not realize the horror of this thing. The influence of the decayed house hung over him. Nothing seemed real. It was quite dark when he moved away from the gate and went in the direction of the nearest police station. That she was dead. This woman, whose very name he did not know, although she influenced him so powerfully. He was certain. One look at the face would have told anyone that. That she was murdered, he more than suspected. He had seen no blood about. There had been no mark on the long, bare throat. And yet, the word rushed in his ears. Murder! Later on, he went back with a police officer. They broke into the house and entered the room. It was in utter darkness, of course, by now. Dent, his fingers trembling, struck a match. It flared round the walls and lighted them for a moment before he let it fall on the dusty floor. The policeman began to light his lantern and turned it stolidly on the window. He had no reason for delay. He was eager to get to the bottom of the business. his professional zeal was whetted. This promised to be a mystery with a spice in it. He turned the light full on the window. He gave a strange, choked cry, half of rage, half of apprehension. Then he went up to Gilbert Dent, who stood in the middle of the room with his hands before his eyes, and took his shoulder and shook it none too gently. "There ain't nobody," he said. Dent looked wildly at the window. The recess was empty, except for the work table. The woman was gone. They searched the house. They minutely inspected the garden. Everything was normal. Everything told the same mournful tale of desertion, of death, of long, empty years. But they found no woman, nor trace of one. "This house," said the policeman, looking suspiciously into the lawyer's face, "has been empty for longer than I can remember. Nobody'll live in it. They do say something about foul play a good many years ago. I don't know about that. All I do know is that the landlord can't get it off his hands." It was doubtful if Gilbert Dent heard one word of what the man was saying. He was too stunned to do anything but creep home when he was allowed to go, and let himself stealthily into his own house with a latchkey. He was afraid even of himself. He did not go to bed that night. As for the mystery of the woman, the matter was allowed to drop. It ended, officially. There was a shrug and a grin at the police station. The impression there was that the lawyer had been drinking, that the dead woman in the empty room was a gruesome freak of his tipsy brain. A week or so later, Dent called on his brother Ned, the one near relation he had. Ned was a doctor. Perhaps he was a shade more matter-of-fact than Gilbert. At all events, when the latter told his story of the house and the woman, he attributed the affair solely to liver. "You are overworked." The elder brother looked at the younger's yellow face. "An experience of this nature is by no means uncommon. Haven't you heard of people having their pet spooks? But this was a real woman," he declared. Well, I was in love with her. I had made up my mind to marry her, if I could." Ned gave him a keen, swift glance. "We'll go to Brighton tomorrow," he said, with quiet decision. "As for your work, everything must be put aside. You've run completely down. You ought to have been taken in hand before." They went to Brighton, and it really seemed as if Ned was right, and that the woman at the window had been merely a nervous creation. It seemed so, that is, for nearly 3 weeks, and then the climax came. It was in the twilight, she had always been part of it, that Gilbert Dent saw her again, the woman that he had found lying dead. They were walking, the two brothers, along the cliffs. The wind was blowing in their faces. The sea was booming beneath the cliff. Ned had just said it was about time they turned back to the hotel and had some dinner, when Gilbert, with a cry, leapt forward to the very edge of the flat grass path on which they were strolling. The movement was so sudden that his brother barely caught him in time. They struggled and swayed on the very edge of the cliff for a second. Gilbert, possessed by some sudden frenzy, seemed resolved to go over, but the other at last dragged him backward, and they rolled together on the close, thick turf. At this point, Gilbert opened his eyes and tried to get on his feet. "Better?" asked his brother, cheerfully, holding out a helping hand. "Strange. The sea has that effect on some people. Didn't think that you were one of them." "What effect?" "Vertigo, my dear fellow." "Ned," said the other solemnly, "I saw her. It is not worth your while to try to account for anything. I have been inclined to think that you were right, that she, the woman at the window, was a fancy. that I had fallen in love with a creation of my own brain. But I saw her again tonight. You must have seen her yourself. She was within a couple of feet of you. Why did you not try and save her? It was nothing short of murder to let her go over like that. I did my best. You certainly did. To kill us both, said Ned grimly. Gilbert gave him a wild look. After luncheon, Ned persuaded him to rest, watched him fall asleep, and then went out. In the porch of the hotel, he was met by a waiter on his return, who told him that Gilbert had left about a quarter of an hour after he had himself gone out. Directly he heard this, he feared the worst. Having, as is usual in such cases, a very hazy idea of what the worst might be. Of course, he must follow without a moment's delay. But a reference to the timetable told him that there was not another train for an hour, and that was slow. It was already getting dusk when he arrived there. He felt certain that Gilbert would go there. He got to the end of the lane and walked up it slowly, examining every house. There would be no difficulty in recognizing the one he wanted. Gilbert had described it in detail more than once. He stood outside the loosely hanging gate at last, and stared through the darkness at the shabby stucco front and rank garden. He went down a flight of steps to the back door, and finding it unfastened, stepped into a stone passage. It was one of the problems of the place that he should have avoided the main entrance door with a half-admitted dread, and that, only half-admitting still, he was afraid to mount the long flight of stone stairs leading from the servants' quarters. However, he pulled himself together and went up to the room. It was quite dark inside. He heard something scuttle across the floor. He felt the grit and dust of years under his feet. He struck a match, just as Gilbert had done, and looked first at the recess in which the window was built. The match flared round the room for a moment and gave him a flash picture of his surroundings. He saw the stripes of gaudy paper moving almost imperceptibly, like tentacles of some sea monster, from the wall. He saw a creature, it looked like a rat, scurry across the floor from the window to the great mantelpiece of hard white marble. If he had seen nothing more than this, he saw in detail all that the first match had flashed at him. He saw his brother lying on the floor, a ghastly coincidence. His hand was caught round the edge of the work table, as hers had been. The other hand was clenched across his breast. There was a look of great agony on his face. A dead face, of course. This was the end of the affair. He was lying dead by the window where the woman had sat every night at dusk and smiled at him. The second match went out. The brother of the dead man struck a third. He looked again and closely. Then he staggered to his feet and gave a cry. It rang through the empty rooms and echoed without wearying down the long stone passages in the basement. Gilbert's head was thrown back. His chin peaked to the ceiling. On his throat were livid marks. The doctor saw them distinctly. He saw the grip of small fingers, the distinct impression of a woman's little hand. The curious thing about the whole story, the most curious thing, perhaps, is that no other eye ever saw those murderous marks. So there was no scandal, no chase after the murderer, no undiscovered crime. They faded. When the doctor saw his brother again, in the full light, and in the presence of others, his throat was clear, and the post-mortem proved that death was due to natural causes. So the matter stands, and will. But where the house and its overgrown garden stood, runs a new road with neat red and white villas. Whatever secret it knew, if any, it kept discreetly. Ned Dent is morbid enough to go down the smart new road in the twilight sometimes and wonder. The end. The Parlor-Car Ghost. All draped with blue denim, the seaside cottage of my friend, Sarah Pine. She asked me to go there with her when she opened it to have it set in order for the summer. She confessed that she felt a trifle nervous at the idea of entering it alone. And I am always ready for an excursion. So much blue denim rather surprised me, because blue is not complementary to Sarah's complexion. She always wears some shade of red, by preference. She perceived my wonder. She is very nearsighted, and therefore sees everything by some sort of sixth sense. "You do not like my portiere and curtains and table covers," said she. "Neither do I. But I did it to accommodate. And now he rests well in his grave, I hope." "Whose grave, for pity's sake?" "Mr. J. Billington Price's." "And who is he?" "He doesn't sound interesting." "Then I will tell you about him," said Sarah, taking a seat directly in front of one of those curtains. "Last autumn, I was leaving this place for New York, traveling on the fast express train known as the Flying Yankee. Of course, I thought of the Flying Dutchman and Wagner's musical setting of the uncanny legend, and how different things are in these days of steam, etc. Then I looked out of the window at the landscape, the horizon that seemed to wheel in a great curve as the train sped on. Every now and then, I had an impression at the tail of the eye that a man was sitting in a chair 3 or 4 numbers in front of me on the opposite side of the car. Each time that I saw this shape, I looked at the chair and ascertained that it was unoccupied. But it was an odd trick of vision. I raised my lorgnette, and the chair showed emptier than before. There was nobody in it, certainly. But the more I knew that it was vacant, the more plainly I saw the man, always with the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. When passengers entered the car, I dreaded lest they might take that seat. What would happen if they should? A bag was put in the chair. That made me uncomfortable. The bag was removed at the next station. Then a baby was placed in the seat. It began to laugh, as though someone had gently tickled it. There was something odd about that chair. 13 was its number. When I looked away from it, the impression was strong upon me that some person sitting there was watching me. Really, it would not do to humor such fancies. So I touched the electric button, asked the porter to bring me a table, and taking from my bag a pack of cards, proceeded to divert myself with a game of patience. I was puzzling where to put a 7 of spades. "Where can it go?" I murmured to myself. A voice behind me prompted. "Play the 4 of diamonds on the 5, and you can do it." I started. The only occupants of the car, besides me, were a bridal couple, a mother with 3 little children, and a typical preacher of one of the straightest sects. Who had spoken? "Play up the 4, madam," repeated this voice. I looked fearfully over my shoulder. At first, I saw a bluish cloud, like cigar smoke, but inodorous. Then the vision cleared, and I saw a young man whom I knew by a subtle intuition to be the occupant, seen and not seen, of chair number 13. Evidently, he was a traveling salesman and a ghost. Of course, a drummer's ghost sounds ridiculous. They're so extremely alive. Or else, you would expect a dead drummer to be particularly dead and not walk. This was a most commonplace-looking ghost, cordial, pushing, businesslike. At the same time, his face had an expression of utter despair and horror, which made him still more preposterous. Of course, it is not nice to let a stranger speak to one, even on so impersonal a topic as a 4 of diamonds. but a ghost. There can't be any rule of etiquette about talking with a ghost. My dear, it was dreadful. That forward creature showed me how to play all the cards, and then begged me to lay them out again, in order that he might give me some clever points. I was too much amazed and disturbed to speak. I could only place the cards at his suggestion. This I did so as not to appear to be listening to the empty air, and be supposed to be a crazy woman. Presently, the ghost spoke again, and told me his story. "Madam," he said, "I have been riding back and forth on this car ever since February 22nd, 1890. 7 months and 11 days. All this time, I have not exchanged a word with anyone. For a drummer, that is pretty hard, you may believe. You know the story of the Flying Dutchman? Well, that is very nearly my case. A curse is upon me, and will not be removed until some kind soul." But I'm getting ahead of my text. That day, there were 4 of us, traveling for different houses. One of the boys was in wool, one in baking powder, one in boots and shoes, and myself in cotton goods. We met on the road, took seats together, and fell into talking shop. Those fellows told big lies about their sales, Washington's birthday though it was. The baking powder man raised the amount of the bills of goods, which he had sold better than a whole can of his stuff could have done. I admitted the straight truth that I had not yet been able to make a sale. And then I swore, not in a light-minded, chipper style of verbal trimmings, but a great, round, heaven-defying oath that I would sell a case of blue denims on that trip, if it took me forever. We became dry with talk, and when the train stopped at Rivermouth, we went out to have some beer. It is good there, you know, pardon me. I forgot that I was speaking to a lady. Well, we had to run to get aboard. I missed my footing, fell under the wheels, and the next thing that I knew, they were holding an inquest over my remains. While I, disemboweled, was sitting on a corner of the undertaker's table, wondering which of the coroner's jury was likely to want a case of blue denims. Then I remembered my wicked oath, and understood that I was a soul doomed to wander until I could succeed in selling that bill of goods. I spoke once or twice, offering the denims under value, but nobody noticed me. Verdict: accidental death, negligence of deceased, railroad corporation not to blame. Deceased got out for beer at his own risk. The other drummers took charge of the remains and wrote a beautiful letter to my relatives about my social qualities and my impressive conversation. I wish it had been less impressive that time. I might have lied about my sales, or I might have said that I hoped for better luck. But after that oath, there was nothing for it. Back and forth, on this road, in chair number 13, to all eternity. Nobody suspects my presence. They sit on my knees. I'm playing in luck when it is a nice baby, as it was this afternoon. They pile wraps, bags, even railway literature on me. They play cards under my nose, and what duffers some of them are. You, madam, are the first person who has perceived me, and therefore I venture to speak to you, meaning no offense. I can see that you are sorry for me. Now, if you recall the story of the Flying Dutchman, he was saved by the charity of a good woman. In fact, Senta married him. Now, I'm not asking anything of that size. I see that you wear a wedding ring, and no doubt you make some man's happiness. I wasn't a marrying man myself, and naturally am not a marrying ghost. And that has nothing to do with the matter anyway. But if you could, I I don't suppose you would have any use for them. But if you were disposed to do a turn of good, solid, Christian charity, I should be everlastingly grateful. And you may have that case of denims at $72.50. And that quality is quoted today at $80. Does it go, madam? The speech of the poor ghost was not very eloquent, but his eyes had an intense, eager glare, which was terrible. Something, pity, fear, I do not know what, compelled me. I decided to do without that white and gold evening cloak. Instead, I gave $72.50 to the ghost and took from him a receipt for the sum, signed J. Billington Price. Then he smiled contentedly, thanked me with emotion, and returned to chair number 13. Several times on the journey, although I did not perceive him again, I felt dazed. When the train arrived at New York, and I, with the other passengers, dismounted, it seemed to me that a strong hand passed under my elbow, steadying me down the steps. As I walked the length of the station, my bag, not heavy at any time, appeared to become weightless. I believe that the Parlor-Car Ghost walked beside me, carrying the bag, whose handle still remained in my other hand. Indeed, once or twice I thought I felt the touch of cold fingers against mine. Since then, I have no reason to suppose that the poor ghost is not at rest. I hope he is. But I never expected nor wished for the blue denims. The next day, however, a dray belonging to a great wholesale house backed up to our door and delivered a case of denims, with a receipted bill for the same. What was I to do? I could not go about selling blue denims. I could not give them away without exciting comment. So I furnished the cottage with them, and you know the effect on my complexion. Pity me, dear, and credit me, frivolous woman as I am, with having saved a soul at the expense of my own vanity. My story is told. What do you think about it? The end. The Burglar's Ghost. I am not an imaginative man, and no one who knows me can say that I have ever indulged in sentimental ideas upon any subject. I am rather predisposed, in fact, to look at everything from a purely practical standpoint, and this quality has been further developed in me by the fact that for 20 years I have been an active member of the detective police force at Westford, a large town in one of our most important manufacturing districts. A policeman, as most people will readily believe, has to deal with so much practical life that he has small opportunity for developing other than practical qualities, and he is more apt to believe in tangible things than in ideas of a somewhat superstitious nature. However, I was once under the firm conviction that I had been largely helped up the ladder of life by the ghost of a once well-known burglar. I have told the story to many and have heard it commented upon in various fashions. Whether the comments were satirical or practical, it made no difference to me. I had a firm faith at that time in the truth of my tale. 18 years ago, I was a plainclothes officer at Westford. I was then 23 years of age and very anxious about two matters. First and foremost, I desired promotion. Second, I wished to be married. Of course, I was more eager about the second than the first, because my sweetheart, Alice Moore, was one of the prettiest and cleverest girls in the town. But I put promotion first for the simple reason that with me, promotion must come before marriage. Knowing this, I was always on the lookout for a chance of distinguishing myself, and I paid such attention to my duties that my superiors began to notice me and foretold a successful career for me in the future. One evening in the last week of September, 1873, I was sitting in my lodgings, wondering what I could do to earn the promotion which I so earnestly wished for. Things were quiet just then in Westford, and I am afraid I half wished that something dreadful might occur if I only could have a share in it. I was pursuing this train of thought when I suddenly heard a voice say, "Good evening, officer." I turned sharply around. It was almost dusk, and my lamp was not lighted. For all that, I could see clearly enough a man who was sitting by a chest of drawers that stood between the door and the window. His chair stood between the drawers and the door, and I concluded that he had quietly entered my room and seated himself before addressing me. "Good evening," I replied. "I didn't hear you come in." He laughed when I said that, a low, chuckling, rather sly laugh. "No," he said, "I dessay not, officer. I'm a very quiet sort of person. You might say, in fact, noiseless. Just so." I looked at him narrowly, feeling considerably surprised and astonished at his presence. He was a thickly built man, with a square face and heavy chin. His nose was small, but aggressive. His eyes were little and overshadowed by heavy eyebrows. I could see them twinkle when he spoke. As for his dress, it was in keeping with his face. He wore a rough suit of woolen or frieze. A thick, gaily colored Belcher neckerchief encircled his bull-like throat, and in his big hands he continually twirled and twisted a fur cap, made apparently out of the skin of some favorite dog. As he sat there smiling at me and saying nothing, it made me feel uncomfortable. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Just a little matter of business," he answered. "You should have gone to the office," I said. "We're not supposed to do business at home." "Right you are, Governor," he replied. "But I wanted to see you. It's you that's got to do my job. If I'd have seen the superintendent, he might have put somebody else onto it. That wouldn't have suited me. You see, officer, you're young and naturally eager-like for promotion." "Eh? What is it you want?" I inquired again. "Ain't you eager to be promoted?" he reiterated. "Ain't you now, officer?" I saw no reason why I should conceal the fact, even from this strange visitor. I admitted that I was eager for promotion. "Ah," he said, with a satisfied smile. "I'm glad of that. It'll make you all the keener. Now, officer, you listen to me. I'm a-going to put you on to a nice little job. Ah, I dessay you'll be a sergeant before long, you will. You'll be complimented and praised for your clever conduct in this 'ere affair. Mark my words if you ain't." "Out with it," I said, fancying I saw through the man's meaning. "You're going to split on some of your pals, I suppose, and you'll want a reward." He shook his head. "A reward," he said, "wouldn't be no use to me at all. No, not if it was £1,000. No, it ain't nothing to do with reward. But now, officer, did you ever hear of Light-Toed Jim?" Light-Toed Jim. I should have been a poor detective if I had not. Why, the man known under that sobriquet was one of the cleverest burglars and thieves in England, and had enjoyed such a famous career that his name was a household word. At that moment, there was an additional interest attached to him. He had been convicted of burglary at the Northminster Assizes in 1871 and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. After serving nearly 2 years of his time, he had escaped from Portland, getting away in such clever fashion that he had never been heard of since. Where he was, no one could say. But lately, there had been a strong suspicion among the police that Light-Toed Jim was at his old tricks again. Light-Toed Jim, I repeated. I should think so. Why? What do you know about him? He smiled and nodded his head. Light-Toed Jim, said he, is in Westford at this identical moment. Listen to me, officer. Light-Toed Jim is going to crack a crib tonight. Said crib is the mansion of Miss Singleton, that rich old lady as lives out on the Mapleton Road. You know her, awfully rich, with naught but women servants and animals about the place. There's some very valuable plate there. That's what Light-Toed Jim's after. He'll get in through the scullery window about 1 a.m., then he'll pass through the back and front kitchens and into the butler's pantry. Only it's a butleress, 'cause there ain't no men at all. And there, he'll set to work on the safe. Some of his late pals in Portland give him the tip about this here job. How did you come to hear of it? I asked. Never mind, Governor. You wouldn't understand. Now, I wants you to be up there tonight and to nab Light-Toed Jim red-handed, so to speak. It'll mean promotion for you, and it'll suit me down to the ground. He wants to be about and to watch him enter. Then follow him and dog him. And be armed, officer, for Jim'll fight like a tiger if you don't draw his teeth first. Now look here, my man, said I. This is all very well, but it's all irregular. You must just tell me who you are and how you come to be in Light-Toed Jim's secrets, and I'll put it down in black and white. I turned away from him to get my writing materials. I was not half a minute with my back to him, but when I turned round, he was gone. The door was shut, but I had heard no sound from it either opening or shutting. Quick as thought, I darted to it, tore it wide open, and looked down the narrow staircase. There was no one there. I ran hastily downstairs into the passage and found my landlady, Mrs. Mariner, standing at the open door with a female friend. Mrs. Mariner, I said, breaking in upon their conversation, which way did that man go who came downstairs just now? Mrs. Mariner looked at me strangely. There ain't been no man come downstairs, Mr. Parker, said she. Leastways, not this good 3/4 of an hour, which me and Mrs. Higgins' ear, as have come out to take an airing, her having been ironing all this blessed day, has been standing here all the time and ain't never seen a soul. Nonsense, I said. A man came down from my room just now, the man you sent up 20 minutes since. Mrs. Mariner looked at me with an expression betokening the most profound astonishment. Mrs. Higgins sighed deeply. Mr. Parker, said Mrs. Mariner, sorry am I to say it, sir, but you're either intoxicated or else you're sickening for brain fever, sir. There ain't no person entered this door, in or out, for nigh onto an hour, as me and Mrs. Higgins here will take our Bible oaths on. I went upstairs and looked in the rooms on either side of mine. The man was not there. I looked under my bed, and of course, he was not there. He must have gone downstairs. But then the women must have seen him. There was only one door to the house. I gave it up in despair and began to smoke my pipe. By the time I had drawn the last whiff, I decided that if anyone was intoxicated, it was probably Mrs. Mariner and Mrs. Higgins, and that my strange visitor had departed by the door. I was not going to believe that he had anything supernatural about him. I had no duty that night. And as the hours wore on, I found myself stern in my resolve to go up to Miss Singleton's house and see what I could make out of my informant's story. It was my opinion that my late visitor was a whilom pal of Light-Toed Jim, and that having become aware of the latter's plot, he had, for some reason of his own, decided to split on his old chum. Thieves' disagreement is an honest man's opportunity, and I determined to solve the truth of the story told me. Lest it should come to nothing, I decided not to report the matter to my chief. If I could really capture Light-Toed Jim, my success would be all the more brilliant by being suddenly sprung upon the authorities. I made my plan of action rapidly. I took a revolver with me and went up to Miss Singleton's house. Fortunately, I knew the housekeeper there, a middle-aged, strong-minded woman, not easily frightened, which was a good thing. To her, I communicated such information as I considered necessary. She consented to conceal me in the room where the safe stood. There was a cupboard close by the safe from which I could command a full view of the burglar's operations and pounce upon him at the right moment. If only my information was to be relied upon, there was every chance of my capturing the famous burglar. Soon after midnight, when the house was all quiet, I went to the pantry and got into the cupboard, locking myself in. There were 2 openings in the panel, through either of which I was able to command a full view of the room. My position was somewhat cramped, but the time soon passed away. My mind was principally occupied in wondering if I was really about to have a chance of distinguishing myself. Somehow, there was an air of unreality about the events of the evening which puzzled me. Suddenly, I heard a sound which put me on the alert at once. It was nothing more than the creaking of a board or opening of a door would make in a quiet house, but it sounded intensified to my expectant ears. I drew myself up against the door of the cupboard and placed my eye to the opening in the panel. I had oiled the key of the door and kept my fingers upon it in readiness to spring upon the burglar at the proper moment. After what seemed some time, I saw the gleam of light through the keyhole of the door, opening into the pantry. Then it opened, and a man carrying a small lantern came gently into the room. At first, I could see nothing of his face, but when my eyes grew accustomed to the hazy light, I saw that I had been rightly informed, and that the burglar was indeed no other than the famous Light-Toed Jim. As I stood there watching him, I could not help admiring the cool fashion in which he went to work. He went over to the window and examined it. He tried the door of the cupboard in which I stood concealed. Then he locked the door of the pantry and turned his attention to the safe. He set his lamp on a chair before the lock and took from his pocket, as neat and pretty, a collection of tools as ever I saw. With these, he went quietly and swiftly to work. Light-Toed. Jim was a somewhat slimly built fellow, with little muscular development about him, while I am a big man, with plenty of bone and sinew. If matters had come to a fight between us, I could have done what I pleased with him. But I knew that Jim would not chance a fight. Somewhere about him, I felt sure there was a revolver, which he would use on the least provocation. My plan, therefore, was to wait until his back was bent over the lock of the safe, then to open the cupboard door noiselessly and fall bodily upon him, pinning him to the ground beneath me. Before long, the moment came. He was working steadily away at the lock, his whole attention concentrated on the job. The slight noise of his drill was sufficient to drown the faint click of the key in the cupboard door. I turned it quickly and tumbled right upon him, driving the tool out of his hands and tumbling him into a heap at the foot of the safe. He uttered an exclamation of rage and astonishment as he went down, and immediately began to wriggle under me like an eel. As I kept him down with one hand, I tried to pull out the handcuffs with the other. This somewhat embarrassed me, and the burglar profited by it to pull out a sharp knife. He had worked himself round on his back, and before I realized what he was after, he was hacking furiously at me with his keen, dagger-like blade. Then I realized that we were going to have a fight for it, and prepared myself. He tried to run the knife into my side. I warded it off, but the blade caught the fleshy part of my left arm, and I felt a warm stream of blood spurt out. That maddened me, and I seized one of the steel drills lying near at hand and hit my man such a blow over the temple that he collapsed at once and lay as if dead. I put the handcuffs on him instantly, and, to make matters still more certain, I secured his ankles. Then I rose and looked at my arm. The knife had made a nasty gash, and the blood was flowing freely, but it was not serious. And when the housekeeper, who had just then appeared on the scene, had bandaged it, I went out and secured the help of the first policeman I met in conveying Light-Toed Jim to the office. I felt a proud man when I made my report to the inspector. "Light-Toed Jim?" said he. "What? James Bland? Nonsense, Parker." But I took him to the cells where Jim was being attended to by the doctor. "You're right, Parker," he said. "That's the man. Well, this will be a fine thing for you." After a time, feeling a little exhausted, I went home to try and get some sleep. The surgeon had attended to my arm and told me it was but a superficial wound. It felt sore enough in spite of that. I had no sooner reached my lodgings than I saw sitting in my easy chair the strange man who had called upon me earlier in the evening. He rose to his feet when I entered. I stared at him in utter astonishment. "Well, Governor," said he, "I see you've done it. You've got him square and fair, I reckon." "Yes," I said. "Ah," he said, with a sigh of complete satisfaction. "Then I'm satisfied. Yes. I don't know as how there's aught more I could say. I reckon as how Light-Toed Jim and me is quits." I was determined to find out who this man was this time. "Sit down," I said. "There's a question or two I must ask you. Just let me get my coat off and I'll talk to you." I took my coat off and went over to the bed to lay it down. "Now then," I began, and looked around at him. I said no more, being literally struck dumb. The man was gone. I began to feel uncomfortable. I ran hastily downstairs, only to find the outer door locked and bolted, as I had left it a few minutes before. I went back, utterly nonplussed. For an hour, I pondered the matter over, but could neither make head nor tail of it. When I went down to the office next morning, I was informed that the burglar wanted to see me. I went to his cell, where he was lying in bed with his head bandaged. I had hit him pretty hard, as it turned out, and it was probable he would have to lie on the sick list for some days. "Well, Governor," said he, "you'd the best of me last night. You hit me rather hard that time." "I was sorry to have to do it, my man," I answered. "You would have stabbed me if you could." "Yes," he said, "I should. But I say, Governor, come a bit closer. I want to ask you a question. How did you know I was on that little job last night? For s'help me, there wasn't a soul knew a breath about it but myself. I hadn't no pals, never talked to anybody about it, never thought aloud about it, as I knows on. How came you to spot it, Governor?" There was no one else in the cell with us, and I thought I might find out something about my mysterious visitor of the night before. "It was a pal of yours who gave me the information," I said. Can't be, Governor. No use telling me that. I ain't got no pals. Leastways, not in this job. Did you ever know a man like this? I described my visitor. As I proceeded, light-toed Jim's face assumed an expression of real terror. Whatever color there was in it faded away. I never saw a man look more thoroughly frightened. Yes, he said eagerly. In course I know who it is. Why, it's Barksy Bill, as I palled with at one time. And what did he say, Governor? That he owed me a grudge? That we was quits at last? Right you are, 'cause he did owe me a grudge. I treated Bill very shabby indeed, and he swore solemn he'd have his revenge. Ani, Governor, what you see wasn't Barksy Bill at all, but his ghost, 'cause Barksy Bill's been dead and buried this 3 year. I was naturally very much exercised in my mind over this weird development of the affair, and I used to think about it long after light-toed Jim had once more retired to the seclusion of Portland. While he was in charge at Westford, I tried more than once to worm some more information out of him about the defunct Barksy Bill, but with no success. He would say no more than that Bill was dead and buried this 3 year, and with that, I had to be content. Gradually, I came to have a firm belief that I had indeed been visited by Barksy Bill's ghost, and I often told the story to brother officers, and sometimes got well laughed at. That, however, mattered little to me. I felt sure that any man who had gone through the same experience would have had the same beliefs. Of course, I got my promotion and was soon afterward married. Things went well with me, and I was lifted from one step to another. In my secret mind, I was always sure I owed my first rise to the burglar's ghost, and I should have continued to think so, but for an incident which occurred just 5 years after my capture of light-toed Jim. I had occasion to travel to Sheffield from Westford, and had to change trains at Leeds. The carriage I stepped into was occupied by a solitary individual who turned his face to me as I sat down. Though dressed in more respectable fashion, I immediately recognized the man who had visited me so mysteriously at my lodgings. My first feeling was one of fear, and I dare say my face showed it, for the man laughed. "Hello, Governor," said he. "I see you knew me as soon as you come in. You owes a deal to me, Governor. Now don't you, eh?" "Look here, my man," I said. "I've been taking you for a ghost these 5 years past. Now just tell me how you got in and out of my room that night, will you?" He laughed long and loud at that. "A ghost?" said he. "Well, if that ain't a good un, why, easy enough, Governor. I was a lodging for a day or two in the same house. It's easy enough, when you know how, to open a door very quiet and to slip out too. But I followed you sharp and looked for you. Aye, Governor, but you looked down, and I had gone up. You should have come up to the attics, and there you'd have found me. So you took me for a ghost? Well, I'm blowed." I told him what light-toed Jim had said in the cell. "Aye," said he. "I do say, Governor. You see, 'twas this way. It weren't Jim's fault, as I wasn't dead. He tried to murder me, Governor, he did, and left me a-lying for dead. So I says to myself when I comes round that I'd pay him out sooner or later. But after that, I quit the profession, Jim's nasty conduct having made me sick of it. So I went in for honest work at my old trade, which was draining and pipe repairing. I was on a job of that sort in Westford, near Miss Singleton's house, when I see light-toed Jim. I had a idea what he was up to, having heard of the plate, and I watches him 1 or 2 nights, and gets a notion how he was going to work the job. You being an officer and close at hand, I splits on him, and that's all. But you had got the time and details correct? Why, of course, Governor. I was an old hand. Served many years at Portland, I have. And I knew just how Jim would work it, after seeing his preliminary observations. But a ghost? Ha, ha, ha. Why, Governor, you must have been a very green young officer in them days. Perhaps I was. At any rate, I learned a lesson from the ci devant Barksy Bill, namely, that in searching a house, it is always advisable to look up as well as down. The end. The Flayed Hand by Guy de Maupassant. One evening, about 8 months ago, I met with some college comrades at the lodgings of our friend Louis R. We drank punch and smoked, talked of literature and art, and made jokes like any other company of young men. Suddenly the door flew open, and one who had been my friend since boyhood burst in like a hurricane. "Guess where I come from?" he cried. "I bet on the Mobile," responded one. "No," said another. "You are too gay. You come from borrowing money, from burying a rich uncle, or from pawning your watch." "You are getting sober," cried a third. "And as you scented the punch in Louis's room, you came up here to get drunk again." "You are all wrong," he replied. "I come from P, in Normandy, where I have spent 8 days, and whence I have brought one of my friends, a great criminal, whom I ask permission to present to you." With these words, he drew from his pocket a long black hand, from which the skin had been stripped. It had been severed at the wrist. Its dry and shriveled shape, and the narrow, yellowed nails still clinging to the fingers, made it frightful to look upon. The muscles, which showed that its first owner had been possessed of great strength, were bound in place by a strip of parchment-like skin. "Just fancy," said my friend. "The other day they sold the effects of an old sorcerer, recently deceased, well known in all the country. Every Saturday night, he used to go to witch gatherings on a broomstick. He practiced the white magic and the black, gave blue milk to the cows, and made them wear tails like that of the companion of St. Anthony. The old scoundrel always had a deep affection for this hand, which, he said, was that of a celebrated criminal, executed in 1736, for having thrown his lawful wife head first into a well, for which I do not blame him, and then hanging in the belfry the priest who had married him. After this double exploit, he went away, and during his subsequent career, which was brief but exciting, he robbed 12 travelers, smoked a score of monks in their monastery, and made a seraglio of a convent. "But what are you going to do with this horror?" we cried. "Eh, parbleu, I will make it the handle to my doorbell and frighten my creditors." "My friend," said Henry Smith, a big, phlegmatic Englishman, "I believe that this hand is only a kind of Indian meat, preserved by a new process. I advise you to make bouillon of it." "Rail not, monsieur," said, with the utmost sang-froid, a medical student who was 3/4 drunk. "But if you follow my advice, Pierre, you will give this piece of human debris Christian burial, for fear lest its owner should come to demand it. Then, too, this hand has acquired some bad habits, for you know the proverb, 'Who has killed will kill.'" "And who has drank will drink," replied the host, as he poured out a big glass of punch for the student, who emptied it at a draught and slid dead drunk under the table. His sudden dropping out of the company was greeted with a burst of laughter, and Pierre, raising his glass and saluting the hand, cried, "I drink to the next visit of thy master." Then Then the conversation turned upon other subjects, and shortly afterward, each returned to his lodgings. About 2 o'clock the next day, as I was passing Pierre's door, I entered and found him reading and smoking. "Well, how goes it?" said I. "Very well," he responded. "And your hand?" "My hand? Did you not see it on the bell pull? I put it there when I returned home last night. But apropos of this, what do you think? Some idiot, doubtless to play a stupid joke on me, came ringing at my door towards midnight. I demanded who was there, but as no one replied, I went back to bed again, and to sleep. At this moment, the door opened, and the landlord, a fat and extremely impertinent person, entered without saluting us. "Sir," said he, "I pray you to take away immediately that carrion, which you have hung to your bell pull. Unless you do this, I shall be compelled to ask you to leave." "Sir," responded Pierre with much gravity, "you insult a hand which does not merit it. Know you that it belonged to a man of high breeding?" The landlord turned on his heel and made his exit without speaking. Pierre followed him, detached the hand, and affixed it to the bell cord hanging in his alcove. "That is better," he said. "This hand, like the brother, all must die, of the Trappists, will give my thoughts a serious turn every night before I sleep." At the end of an hour, I left him and returned to my own apartment. I slept badly the following night, was nervous and agitated, and several times awoke with a start. Once I imagined even that a man had broken into my room, and I sprang up and searched the closets and under the bed. Towards 6 o'clock in the morning, I was commencing to doze at last, when a loud knocking at my door made me jump from my couch. It was my friend Pierre's servant, half-dressed, pale, and trembling. "Ah, sir," cried he, sobbing, "my poor master. Someone has murdered him." I dressed myself hastily and ran to Pierre's lodgings. The house was full of people disputing together, and everything was in a commotion. Everyone was talking at the same time, recounting and commenting on the occurrence in all sorts of ways. With great difficulty, I reached the bedroom, made myself known to those guarding the door, and was permitted to enter. 4 agents of police were standing in the middle of the apartment, pencils in hand, examining every detail, conferring in low voices, and writing from time to time in their notebooks. 2 doctors were in consultation by the bed, on which lay the unconscious form of Pierre. He was not dead, but his face was fixed in an expression of the most awful terror. His eyes were open their widest, and the dilated pupils seemed to regard fixedly, with unspeakable horror, something unknown and frightful. His hands were clenched. I raised the quilt, which covered his body from the chin downward, and saw on his neck, deeply sunk in the flesh, the marks of fingers. Some drops of blood spotted his shirt. At that moment, one thing struck me. I chanced to notice that the shriveled hand was no longer attached to the bell cord. The doctors had doubtless removed it to avoid the comments of those entering the chamber where the wounded man lay, because the appearance of this hand was indeed frightful. I did not inquire what had become of it. I now clip from a newspaper of the next day the story of the crime with all the details that the police were able to procure. A frightful attempt was made yesterday on the life of young Monsieur Pierre B., student, who belongs to one of the best families in Normandy. He returned home about 10 o'clock in the evening and excused his valet Bouvin from further attendance upon him, saying that he felt fatigued and was going to bed. Towards midnight, Bouvin was suddenly awakened by the furious ringing of his master's bell. He was afraid, and lighted a lamp and waited. The bell was silent about a minute, then rang again with such vehemence that the domestic, mad with fright, flew from his room to awaken the concierge, who ran to summon the police. And at the end of about 15 minutes, 2 policemen forced open the door. A horrible sight met their eyes. The furniture was overturned, giving evidence of a fearful struggle between the victim and his assailant. In the middle of the room, upon his back, his body rigid, with livid face and frightfully dilated eyes, lay, motionless, young Pierre B., bearing upon his neck the deep imprints of 5 fingers. Dr. Bourdian was called immediately, and his report says that the aggressor must have been possessed of prodigious strength and have had an extraordinarily thin and sinewy hand, because the fingers left in the flesh of the victim 5 holes, like those from a pistol ball, and had penetrated until they almost met. There's no clue to the motive of the crime or to its perpetrator. The police are making a thorough investigation. The following appeared in the same newspaper next day. Monsieur Pierre B., the victim of the frightful assault of which we published an account yesterday, has regained consciousness after 2 hours of the most assiduous care by Dr. Bourdian. His life is not in danger, but it is strongly feared that he has lost his reason. No trace has been found of his assailant. My poor friend was indeed insane. For 7 months, I visited him daily at the hospital where we had placed him, but he did not recover the light of reason. In his delirium, strange words escaped him, and, like all madmen, he had one fixed idea. He believed himself continually pursued by a specter. One day they came for me in haste, saying he was worse, and when I arrived, I found him dying. For 2 hours he remained very calm. Then, suddenly, rising from his bed in spite of our efforts, he cried, waving his arms as if a prey to the most awful terror, "Take it away! Take it away! It strangles me! Help! Help!" Twice he made the circuit of the room, uttering horrible screams, then fell face downward, dead. As he was an orphan, I was charged to take his body to the little village of P in Normandy, where his parents were buried. It was the place from which he had arrived the evening he found us drinking punch in Louis R's room, when he had presented to us the Flayed Hand. His body was enclosed in a leaden coffin, and 4 days afterwards, I walked sadly beside the old curé, who had given him his first lessons, to the little cemetery where they dug his grave. It was a beautiful day, and sunshine from a cloudless sky flooded the earth. Birds sang from the blackberry bushes, where many a time when we were children we had stolen to eat the fruit. Again, I saw Pierre and myself creeping along behind the hedge and slipping through the gap that we knew so well, down at the end of the little plot where they bury the poor. Again, we would return to the house with cheeks and lips black with the juice of the berries we had eaten. I looked at the bushes. They were covered with fruit. Mechanically, I picked some and bore it to my mouth. The curé had opened his breviary and was muttering his prayers in a low voice. I heard at the end of the walk the spades of the gravediggers who were opening the tomb. Suddenly, they called out. The curé closed his book, and we went to see what they wished of us. They had found a coffin. In digging, a stroke of the pickaxe had started the cover, and we perceived within a skeleton of unusual stature, lying on its back, its hollow eyes seeming yet to menace and defy us. I was troubled, I know not why, and almost afraid. "Hold," said one of the men. "Look there. One of the rascal's hands has been severed at the wrist. Ah, here it is." And he picked up from beside the body a huge withered hand and held it out to us. "See," cried the other, laughing. "See how he glares at you, as if he would spring at your throat to make you give him back his hand." "Go," said the cure. "Leave the dead in peace, and close the coffin. We will make poor Pierre's grave elsewhere." The next day, all was finished, and I returned to Paris, after having left 50 francs with the old cure for masses to be said, for the repose of the soul of him whose sepulchre we had troubled. The end. The Phantom Hag. The other evening, in an old castle, the conversation turned upon apparitions, each one of the party telling a story. As the accounts grew more horrible, the young ladies drew closer together. "Have you ever had an adventure with a ghost?" said they to me. "Do you not know a story to make us shiver? Come, tell us something." "I am quite willing to do so," I replied. "I will tell you of an incident that happened to myself. Toward the close of the autumn of 1858, I visited one of my friends, sub-prefect of a little city in the center of France. Albert was an old companion of my youth, and I had been present at his wedding. His charming wife was full of goodness and grace. My friend wished to show me his happy home and to introduce me to his 2 pretty little daughters. I was feted and taken great care of. 3 days after my arrival, I knew the entire city, curiosities, old castles, ruins, etc. Every day about 4 o'clock, Albert would order the phaeton, and we would take a long ride, returning home in the evening. One evening, my friend said to me, "Tomorrow, we will go further than usual. I want to take you to the Black Rocks. They are curious old druidical stones on a wild and desolate plain. They will interest you. My wife has not seen them yet, so we will take her." The following day, we drove out at the usual hour. Albert's wife sat by his side. I occupied the back seat alone. The weather was gray and somber that afternoon, and the journey was not very pleasant. When we arrived at the Black Rocks, the sun was setting. We got out of the phaeton, and Albert took care of the horses. We walked some little distance through the fields before reaching the giant remains of the old Druid religion. Albert's wife wished to climb to the summit of the altar, and I assisted her. I can still see her graceful figure as she stood draped in a red shawl, her veil floating around her. "How beautiful it is! But does it not make you feel a little melancholy?" said she, extending her hand toward the dark horizon, which was lighted a little by the last rays of the sun. The afternoon wind blew violently and sighed through the stunted trees that grew around the stone cromlechs. Not a dwelling nor a human being was in sight. We hastened to get down and silently retraced our steps to the carriage. "We must hurry," said Albert. "The sky is threatening, and we shall have scarcely time to reach home before night." We carefully wrapped the robes around his wife. She tied the veil around her face, and the horses started into a rapid trot. It was growing dark. The scenery around us was bare and desolate. Clumps of fir trees here and there, and furze bushes formed the only vegetation. We began to feel the cold, for the wind blew with fury. The only sound we heard was the steady trot of the horses and the sharp, clear tinkle of their bells. Suddenly, I I felt the heavy grasp of a hand upon my shoulder. I turned my head quickly. A horrible apparition presented itself before my eyes. In the empty place at my side sat a hideous woman. I tried to cry out. The phantom placed her fingers upon her lips to impose silence upon me. I could not utter a sound. The woman was clothed in white linen. Her head was cowled. Her face was overspread with a corpse-like pallor, and in place of eyes were ghastly black cavities. I sat motionless, overcome by terror. The ghost suddenly stood up and leaned over the young wife. She encircled her with her arms and lowered her hideous head as if to kiss her forehead. "What a wind!" cried Madame Albert, turning precipitately toward me. "My veil is torn." As she turned, I felt the same infernal pressure on my shoulder, and the place occupied by the phantom was empty. I looked out to the right and left. The road was deserted, not an object in sight. "What a dreadful gale," said Madame Albert. "Did you feel it?" I cannot explain the terror that seized me. My veil was torn by the wind as if by an invisible hand. I am trembling still. "Never mind," said Albert, smiling. "Wrap yourself up, my dear. We will soon be warming ourselves by a good fire at home. I am starving." A cold perspiration covered my forehead. A shiver ran through me. My tongue clove to the roof of my mouth, and I could not articulate a sound. A sharp pain in my shoulder was the only sensible evidence that I was not the victim of an hallucination. Putting my hand upon my aching shoulder, I felt a rent in the cloak that was wrapped around me. I looked at it. 5 perfectly distinct holes, visible traces of the grip of the horrible phantom. I thought for a moment that I should die, or that my reason should leave me. It was, I think, the most dreadful moment of my life. Finally, I became more calm. This nameless agony had lasted for some minutes. I do not think it is possible for a human being to suffer more than I did during that time. As soon as I had recovered my senses, I thought at first I would tell my friends all that had passed, but hesitated, and finally did not, fearing that my story would frighten Madame Albert, and feeling sure my friend would not believe me. The lights of the little city revived me, and gradually the oppression of terror that overwhelmed me became lighter. So soon as we reached home, Madame Albert untied her veil. It was literally in shreds. I hoped to find my clothes whole and prove to myself that it was all imagination. But no, the cloth was torn in 5 places, just where the fingers had seized my shoulder. There was no mark, however, upon my flesh, only a dull pain. I returned to Paris the next day, where I endeavored to forget the strange adventure, or at least when I thought of it, I would force myself to think it an hallucination. The day after my return, I received a letter from my friend Albert. It was edged with black. I opened it with a vague fear. His wife had died the day of my return. The end. The Vengeance of a Tree by Eleanor F. Lewis. Through the windows of Jim Daly's saloon in the little town of C, the setting sun streamed in yellow patches, lighting up the glasses scattered on the tables and the faces of several men who were gathered near the bar. Farmers, mostly, they were, with a sprinkling of shopkeepers, while prominent among them was the village editor, and all were discussing a startling piece of news that had spread through the town and its surroundings. The tidings that Walter Stedman, a laborer on Albert Kelsey's ranch, had assaulted and murdered his employer's daughter, had reached them and had spread universal horror among the people. farmer declared that he had seen the deed committed as he walked through a neighboring lane, and, having always been noted for his cowardice, instead of running to the girl's aid, had hailed a party of miners who were returning from their midday meal through a field nearby. When they reached the spot, however, where Stedman, as they supposed, had done his black deed, only the girl lay there, in the stillness of death. Her murderer had taken the opportunity to fly. The party had searched the woods of the Kelsey estate, and just as they were nearing the house itself, the appearance of Walter Stedman, walking in a strangely unsteady manner toward it, made them quicken their pace. He was soon in custody, although he had protested his innocence of the crime. He said that he had just seen the body himself on his way to the station, and that when they had found him, he was going to the house for help. But they had laughed at his story and had flung him into the tiny, stifling calaboose of the town. What were their proofs? Walter Stedman, a young fellow of about 26, had come from the city to their quiet town, just when times were at their hardest, in search of work. The most of the men living in the town were honest fellows, doing their work faithfully when they could get it. And when they had socially asked Stedman to have a drink with them, he had refused in rather a scornful manner. That infernal city chap, he was called. And their hate and envy increased in strength when Albert Kelsey had employed him in preference to any of themselves. As time went on, the story of Stedman's admiration for Margaret Kelsey had gone afloat, with the added information that his employer's daughter had repulsed him, saying that she would not marry a common laborer. So Stedman, when this news reached his employer's ears, was discharged. And this, then, was his revenge. For them, these proofs were sufficient to pronounce him guilty. Yet, that afternoon, as Stedman, crouched on the floor of the calaboose, grew hopeless in the knowledge that no one would believe his story, and that his undeserved punishment would be swift and sure, a tramp boarding a freight car several miles from the town sped away from the spot where his crime had been committed, and knew that forever its shadow would follow him. From the tiny window of his prison, Walter Stedman could see the red glow of the heavens that betokened the setting of the sun. So the red sun of his life was soon to set, a life that had been innocent of all crime, and that now was to be ended for a deed that he had never committed. Most prominent of all the visions that swept through his mind was that of Margaret Kelsey, lying as he had first found her, fresh from the hands of her murderer. But there was another of a more tender nature. How long he and Margaret had tried to keep their secret, until Walter could be promoted to a higher position, so that he could ask for her hand with no fear of the father's antagonism. Then came the remembrance of an afternoon meeting between the two in the woods of the Kelsey estate. How, just as they were parting, Walter had heard footsteps near them, and glancing sharply around, saw an evil, scowling, murderous face peering through the brush. He had started toward it, but the owner of the countenance had taken himself hurriedly off. The gossiping townspeople had misconstrued this romance, and when Albert Kelsey had heard of this clandestine meeting from the man who was later on to appear as a leader of the mob, and that he had discharged Stedman, they had believed that the young man had formally proposed and had been rejected. But justice had gone wrong, as it had done innumerable times before, and will again. An innocent man was to be hanged, even without the comfort of a trial, while the man who was guilty was free to wander where he would. That autumn night, the darkness came quickly, and only the stars did their best to light the scene. A body of men, all masked, and having as a leader one who had ever since Stedman's arrival in town cherished a secret hatred of the young man, dragged Stedman from the calaboose and tramped through the town, defying all, defying even God himself. Along the highway and into Farmer Brown's crosscut they went, vigilantly guarding their prisoner, who, with the lanterns lighting up his haggard face, walked among them with the lagging step of utter hopelessness. "That's a good tree," their leader said presently, stopping and pointing out a spreading oak. When the slipknot was adjusted and Stedman had stepped on the box, he added, "If you've got anything to say, you'd better say it now." "I am innocent, I swear before God," the doomed man answered. "I never took the life of Margaret Kelsey." "Give us your proof," jeered the leader, and when Stedman kept a despairing silence, he laughed shortly. "Ready, men," he gave the order. The box was kicked aside, and then only a writhing body swung to and fro in the gloom. In front of the men stood their leader, watching the contortions of the body with silent glee. "I'll tell you a secret, boys," he said suddenly. "I was after that poor murdered girl myself. A little chance I had. But he had just as little." A pause. Then, "He's shunted this earth. Cut him down, you fellows." "It's no use, son. I'll give up the blasted thing as a bad job. There's something queer about that there tree. Do you see how its branches balance it? We have cut the trunk nearly in two, but it won't come down. There's plenty of others around. We'll take one of them. If I'd a long rope with me, I'd get that tree down. And yet, the way the thing stands it would be risking a fellow's life to climb it. It's got the devil in it, sure." So old Farmer Brown shouldered his axe and made for another tree, his son following. They had sawed and chopped and chopped and sawed, and yet the tall white oak, with its branches jutting out almost as regularly, as if done by the work of a machine, stood straight and firm. Farmer Brown, well known for his weak, cowardly spirit, who, in beholding the murder of Albert Kelsey's daughter, had in his fright mistaken the criminal, now, in his superstition, let the oak stand, because its well-balanced position saved it from falling when other trees would have been down. And so, this tree, the same one to which an innocent man had been hanged, was left for other work. It was a bleak, rainy night, such a night as can be found only in Central California. The wind howled like 1,000 demons and lashed the trees together in wild embraces. Now and then, the weird hoot, hoot of an owl came softly from the distance in the lulls of the storm, while the barking of coyotes woke the echoes of the hills into sounds like fiendish laughter. In the wind and rain, a man fought his path through the bush and into Farmer Brown's crosscut as the shortest way home. Suddenly, he stopped, trembling, as if held by some unseen impulse. Before him rose the white oak, wavering and swaying in the storm. "Good God, it's the tree I swung Stedman from," he cried, and a strange fear thrilled him. His eyes were fixed on it, held by some undefinable fascination. Yes, there on one of the longest branches, a small piece of rope still dangled. And then, to the murderer's excited vision, this rope seemed to lengthen, to form at the end into a slip knot, a knot that encircled a purple neck, while below it writhed and swayed the body of a man. "Damn him," he muttered, starting toward the hanging form. rope in its work of strangulation. Will he forever follow me? And yet, he deserved it, the black-hearted villain. He took her life. He never finished the sentence. The white oak, towering above him in its strength, seemed to grow like a frenzied, living creature. There was a sudden, splitting sound. Then came a crash. And under the fallen tree lay Stedman's murderer, crushed and mangled. From between the broken trunk and the stump that was left, a gray, dim shape sprang out and sped past the man's still form, away into the wild blackness of the night. The end. Ghost of Buckstown Inn by Arnold M. Anderson. Several travel-worn drummers sat in the lobby exchanging yarns. It was Rodney Green's turn, and he looked wise and began his tale. I don't claim, by any means, that the belief in ghosts is a general thing in Arkansas, but I do say that I had an experience out there a few years ago. It was late in the fall, and I happened to be in the village of Buckstown, which desecrates a very limited portion of the state. The town is about as small and dirty a place as ever I saw, and the Buckstown Inn is not much above the general character of the place. The region is inhabited by natives who still cling to all sorts of foolish superstitions. The inn, in the antebellum days, was kept by one who was said to be the meanest and most crabbed of mortals. The old demon was as miserly as he was mean, and all his narrow life he hoarded his filthy lucre with fiendish greed. Report had it also that he had even murdered his patrons in their beds for their money. What the facts actually were, I don't know, but even to this day, the old inn is held in suspicion. A lingering effect of former horrors still clouds its memory. The present proprietor, Bunk Watson, his real name is Bunker, I believe, is an altogether different sort of chap, a southern type, in fact. One of those shiftless, heedless, happy-go-lucky mortals who loves strong whiskey and who chews an enormous quid of black tobacco and smokes a corncob pipe at the same time. When the former keepers huffled off, his property fell to a distant relative, the present keeper, who, with his family, immediately moved in from a neighboring hamlet and took possession. It was well known that the old proprietor had accumulated considerable wealth during his sojourn among the living, but all efforts to discover any treasure upon the premises had failed. And now, the idea of ever finding it was practically given up. As far as Bunk was concerned, the matter troubled him little. He had a hard-working wife who ran things the best she could under the circumstances, and saw that his meals were forthcoming at their respective intervals. What more could he wish? Why should he care if there was a treasure buried upon his place? Indeed, it would have been a sore puzzle for him to know what to do with a fortune, unless perhaps his wife came to his aid. Among the stories that hovered in the history of the Buckstown Inn was one which involved a ghost. In the room where the former keeper had died, peculiar noises were heard at unearthly hours. Sighing, moaning, and, in fact, all the other indications which point to the existence of ghosts were said to be present. On account of this, the chamber had long since been abandoned. I listened with keen interest to the wonderful tales about the haunted room, and then suddenly resolved to investigate, to sleep in that chamber that very night, and see for myself all that was to be seen. I told Buck of my purpose. He shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, but instead of warning me and offering a flood of protests, as I expected, he merely took his pipe from his mouth let fly a quart or so of yellowish juice from between a pair of brown-stained lips, and, opening one corner of his wide mouth, lazily called out, "Jane." His wife appeared, and he intimated that I should settle the matter with the old woman. The prospect of a fee persuaded the wife, and off she went to arrange for my bed in that ill-fated room. At 9 o'clock that evening, I bid the family good night, took my candle, ascended the rickety stairs, and entered the chamber of horrors. The atmosphere was heavy and had a peculiar odor that was not at all pleasing. However, I latched the door and was soon in bed. Having propped myself up with pillows, I was prepared to await the coming of the ghost. Overhead, the dusty rafters, which once had experienced the sensation of being whitewashed, but which were now a dirty, yellowish color, were hung with a fantastic array of cobwebs. The flickering light of the candle reflected upon the walls and against the ceiling a pyramid of grotesque shapes, and with this effect being continually disturbed by the swaying cobwebs, the whole caused the room to appear rather ghostly after all, and especially so to an imaginative mind. I waited and waited for hours, it seemed, but still no ghost. Perhaps it was afraid of my candlelight, so I blew it out. No sooner had I done this and settled back in bed again than a white hand appeared through the door, then a whole figure. At last the ghost had come, a white and sheeted ghost. It had come right through the door, although it was locked, and now it advanced toward the bed. Raising its long white arm, it pointed a bony finger at me, and then commanded, "Come with me." Thereupon, it turned to the door, while instantly I jumped out of bed to follow. Some unseen power compelled me to obey. The door flew open, and the ghost led me down the stairs, through long halls into the cellar, through mysterious underground corridors, upstairs again, in and out rooms which I never dreamed were to be found in that old, rambling inn. Finally, through a small door in the rear, we left the house. I was in my sleeping garments, but no matter, I had to follow. The white form, with a slow and measured tread, and as silent as death, led the way into the orchard. There, under a tree at the farther end, it pointed to the ground, and in the same ghostly tones before used, said, "Here you will find a great treasure buried." The ghost then disappeared, and I saw it no more. I stood dazed and trembling. Upon recovering my wits, I started to dig, but the chill of the night air and the scantiness of my night robes made such labor impracticable. So I decided to leave some mark to identify the place and come around again at daybreak. I reached up and broke off a limb. Overcome with my night's exertions, I slept the next morning until a loud rapping on my door and a croaking voice warned me that it was noon. I had intended to leave Buckstown Inn that day, but, prompted by curiosity and anxious to investigate, I unpacked my gripsack for a comfortable stay. You must understand that this was my first experience with a ghost, and I feared I might never see another. At breakfast, my landlady waited on me in silence, though once I detected her eyes following me with a peculiar expression. She wanted to ask me how I enjoyed the night, but I would not gratify her by volunteering a word. My host was more outspoken. "Reckon you didn't get much sleep," said he, with a queer smile. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "Well, I did, yes," he said with a drawl. "But you didn't disturb me any. I knew you'd have trouble when you went in that room to sleep." That afternoon, I slipped out to the tree, But to my amazement, I found that the twig I had broken from the branches was gone. Finally, I found under the lower trunk of an apple tree an open place from which a small branch had evidently been wrested. But on looking further, I discovered that every apple tree in the orchard had been similarly disfigured. More mysterious than ever, I said, but tonight shall decide. That night, I pleaded weariness, which no one seemed inclined to question, and sought my couch earlier. Going to try it again? Asked my host. Yes, and I'll stay all winter, but what I'll get even with that ghost, I said. That night, I kept the candle burning until midnight, when I blew it out. Instantly, the room was flooded with a soft light, and at the foot of the bed stood my ghost, the identical ghost of last night. Again, the bony finger beckoned, and a sepulchral voice whispered, "Follow me." I sprang from the bed, but the figure darted ahead of me. It flew through the doorway and down the stairs, and I after it. At the foot of the staircase, an unseen hand reached forward and caught my foot, and I fell sprawling headlong. But in a second, I was on my feet and pursuing the ghost. It had gained on me a few yards, but I was quicker. And just as we reached the outside door, I nearly touched its robes. They sent a chill through my frame, and I nearly gave up the pursuit. As it passed through the doorway, it turned and gave me one look, and I caught the same malignant light in its eyes that I remembered from the night before. In the open orchard, I felt sure I could catch it. But my ghost had no intention of allowing me any such opportunity. To my disgust, it darted backward and into the house, slamming the door in my face. In my frenzy of fear and chagrin, I threw myself against the oaken door with such force that its rusty old hinges yielded, and I landed in the big front room of the inn just in time to see the white skirts of the ghost flit up the stairs. Upstairs, I flew after it and into an old chamber. There, huddled in a corner, I saw it. In the minute's delay, it had secured a lighted candle, and as I entered, it advanced to daunt me with bony arm upraised to a great height. "Caught!" I cried, throwing my arms around the figure. And I had made the acquaintance of a real live ghost. The white robes fell, and I saw revealed my hostess of Buckstown Inn. Next morning, when I threatened to call the police, she confessed to me that she masqueraded as a ghost to draw visitors to the out-of-the-way old place, and that she found its tale of being haunted highly profitable to her. The end. A phantom toe. I am not a superstitious man, far from it. But despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness and gloom, that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute skepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favorite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me and put strange fancies into my head. Be this as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetiness that at last I wasn't sure whether I hadn't become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber, and should have taken the lock and bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of the night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cutthroat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat, all Dutchmen are fat, stupid-looking fellow, who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and it certainly was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimeras of our own brain. So, on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle, for total darkness was far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's riding. How long I lay asleep, I don't know, but I suddenly awoke from a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long, winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling, such as I never before experienced, hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it. And this was accompanied by so great a heat that inwardly cursing mine host's sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchman could endure such poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, excepting at one place, where the moonlight, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line of about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe, nothing more. For the first instant, I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not see distinctly. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still, there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has traveled so much and seen so much and been exposed to so many dangers as I can be. But there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe that for a short time I could not think what to be at. So I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words, I leaped out of bed and rushed toward the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant, I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this, I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, excepting that a fearful struggle ensued between me and my unseen opponent. That every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace. That we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsive and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being, actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant, that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek and arm to arm, in fierce contest, until the room appeared to whiz round with us, and that at least 12 people, my fellow traveler among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long, tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received in the conflict several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at The Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delft on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood peculiar to many insane people, had possessed himself of a pocket knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house unfastened, and was probably meditating the fatal stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his, he was watched with much greater strictness, but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted. The end. From The Tomb, translated from the French of de Maupassant by E.C. Wagoner. The guests filed slowly into the hotel's great dining hall and took their places. The waiters began to serve them leisurely, to give the tardy ones time to arrive and to save themselves the bother of bringing back the courses. And the old bathers, the yearly habitués, with whom the season was far advanced, kept a close watch on the door each time it opened, hoping for the coming of new faces. New faces, the single distraction of all pleasure resorts. We go to dinner chiefly to canvass the daily arrivals, to wonder who they are, what they do, and what they think. A restless desire seems to have taken possession of us, a longing for pleasant adventures, for friendly acquaintances perhaps, for possible lovers. In this elbow-to-elbow life, our unknown neighbors become of paramount importance. Curiosity is piqued, sympathy on the alert, and the social instinct doubly active. We have hatreds for a week, friendships for a month, and view all men with the special eyes of watering-place intimacy. Sometimes during an hour's chat after dinner, under the trees of the park, where ripples a healing spring, we discover men of superior intellect and surprising merit, and a month later have wholly forgotten these new friends, so charming at first sight. There, too, more specially than elsewhere, serious and lasting ties are formed. We see each other every day. We learn to know each other very soon, and in the affection that springs up so rapidly between us, there is mingled much of the sweet abandon of old and tried intimates. And later on, how tender are the memories cherished of the first hours of this friendship, of the first communion in which the soul came to light, of the first glances that questioned and responded to the secret thoughts and interrogatories the lips have not dared yet to utter, of the first cordial confidence and delicious sensation of opening one's heart to someone who has seemed to lay bare to you his own. The very dullness of the hours, as it were, the monotony of days, all alike, but renders more complete the rapid budding and blooming of friendship's flower. That evening, then, as on every evening, we awaited the appearance of unfamiliar faces. There came only two, but very peculiar ones, those of a man and a woman, father and daughter. They seemed to have stepped from the pages of some weird legend, and yet there was an attraction about them, albeit an unpleasant one, that made me set them down at once as the victims of some fatality. The father was tall, spare, a little bent, with hair blanched white. Too white for his still young countenance, and in his manner and about his person, the sedate austerity of carriage that bespeaks the Puritan. The daughter was, possibly, some 24 or 25 years of age. She was very slight, emaciated, her exceedingly pale countenance bearing a languid, spiritless expression. One of those people whom we sometimes encounter, apparently too weak for the cares and tasks of life, too feeble to move or do the things that we must do every day. Nevertheless, the girl was pretty, with the ethereal beauty of an apparition. It was she, undoubtedly, who came for the benefit of the waters. They chanced to be placed at table immediately opposite to me, and I was not long in noticing that the father, too, had a strange affection. Something wrong about the nerves, it seemed. Whenever he was going to reach for anything, his hand, with a jerky twitch, described a sort of fluttering zigzag before he was able to grasp what he was after. Soon, the motion disturbed me so much, I kept my head turned in order not to see it. But not before I had also observed that the young girl kept her glove on her left hand while she ate. Dinner ended. I went out, as usual, for a turn in the grounds belonging to the establishment. A sort of park, I might say, stretching clear to the little station of Auvergne, Châtel-Guyon, nestling in a gorge at the foot of the high mountain, from which flowed the sparkling, bubbling springs, hot from the furnace of an ancient volcano. Beyond us there, the domes, small, extinct craters, of which Châtel-Guyon is the starting point, raised their serrated heads above the long chain. While beyond the domes came two distinct regions, one of them needle-like peaks, the other of bold, precipitous mountains. It was very warm that evening, and I contented myself with pacing to and fro under the rustling trees, gazing at the mountains and listening to the strains of the band pouring from the casino, situated on a knoll that overlooked the grounds. Presently, I perceived the father and daughter coming toward me with slow steps. I bowed to them in that pleasant, continental fashion with which one always salutes his hotel companions. The gentleman halted at once. "Pardon me, sir," said he, "but may I ask if you can direct us to a short walk, easy and pretty, if possible?" "Certainly," I answered, and offered to lead them myself to the valley through which the swift river flows, a deep, narrow cleft between two great declivities, rocky and wooded. They accepted, and as we walked, we naturally discussed the virtue of the mineral waters. They had, as I had surmised, come there on his daughter's account. "She has a strange malady," said he, "the seat of which her physicians cannot determine. She suffers from the most inexplicable nervous symptoms. Sometimes they declare her ill of a heart disease, sometimes of a liver complaint, again of a spinal trouble. At present, they attribute it to the stomach, that great motor and regulator of the body, this Protean disease of 1,000 forms, 1,000 modes of attack. It is why we are here. I, myself, think it is her nerves. In any case, it is sad." This reminded me of his own jerking hand. "It may be hereditary," said I. "Your own nerves are a little disturbed, are they not?" "Mine," he answered tranquilly. "Not at all. I have always possessed the calmest nerves." Then, suddenly, as if bethinking himself, "For this," touching his hand, "is not nerves, but the result of a shock, a terrible shock that I suffered once. Fancy it, sir. This child of mine has been buried alive. I could find nothing to say. I was dumb with surprise. Yes, he continued, buried alive. But hear the story. It is not long. For some time past, Juliet had seemed affected with a disordered action of the heart. We were finally certain that the trouble was organic and feared the worst. One day it came. She was brought in lifeless, dead. She had fallen dead while walking in the garden. Physicians came in haste, but nothing could be done. She was gone. For 2 days and nights, I watched beside her myself, and with my own hands placed her in her coffin, which I followed to the cemetery and saw placed in the family vault. This was in the country, in the province of Lorraine. It had been my wish, too, that she should be buried in her jewels, bracelets, necklace, and rings, all presents that I had given her, and in her first ball dress. You can imagine, sir, the state of my heart in returning home. She was all that I had left. My wife had been dead for many years. I returned in truth, half mad, shut myself alone in my room, and fell into my chair dazed, unable to move, merely a miserable, breathing wreck. Soon, my old valet, Prosper, who had helped me place Juliet in her coffin and lay her away for her last sleep, came in noiselessly to see if he could not induce me to eat. I shook my head, answering nothing. He persisted. Monsieur is wrong. This will make him ill. Will Monsieur allow me, then, to put him to bed? No, I answered. Let me alone. He yielded and withdrew. How many hours passed, I do not know. What a night. It was very cold. My fire of logs had long since burned out in the great fireplace, and the wind, a wintry blast, charged with an icy frost, howled and screamed about the house, and strained at my windows with a curiously sinister sound. Long hours, I say, rolled by. I sat still where I had fallen, prostrated, overwhelmed, my eyes wide open, but my body strengthless, dead, my soul drowned in despair. Suddenly, the great bell gave a loud peal. I gave such a leap that my chair cracked under me. The slow, solemn sound rang through the empty house. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. Who could be coming at such an hour? Twice again, the bell pulled sharply. The servants would never answer, perhaps never hear it. I took up a candle and made my way to the door. I was about to demand, "Who is there?" But, ashamed of the weakness, nerved myself and drew back the bolts. My heart throbbed, my pulse beat. I threw back the panel brusquely, and there, in the darkness, saw a shape like a phantom, dressed in white. I recoiled, speechless with anguish, stammering, Who are you?" A voice answered, "It is I, Father." It was my child, Juliet. Truly, I thought myself mad. I shuddered, shrinking backward before the spectre as it advanced, gesticulating with my hand to ward off the apparition. It is that gesture which has never left me. Again, the phantom spoke. "Father, Father, see, I am not dead. Someone came to rob me of my jewels. They cut off my finger. The flowing blood revived me. And I saw then that she was covered with blood. I fell to my knees, panting, sobbing, laughing, all in one. As soon as I regained my senses, but still so bewildered I scarcely comprehended the happiness that had come to me, I took her in my arms, carried her to her room, and rang frantically for Prosper to rekindle the fire, bring a warm drink for her, and go for the doctor. He came running, entered, gazed a moment at my daughter in the chair, gave a gasp of fright and horror, and fell back, dead. It It was he who had opened the vault, who had wounded and robbed my child, and then abandoned her, for he could not efface all trace of his deed, and he had not even taken the trouble to return the coffin to its niche. Sure, besides, of not being suspected by me, who trusted him so fully. We are truly very unfortunate people, monsieur. He was silent. Meanwhile, the night had come on, enveloping in the gloom the still and solitary little valley. A sort of mysterious dread seemed to fall upon me in presence of these strange beings, this corpse come to life, and this father with his painful gestures. "Let us return," said I. "The night has grown chill." And still in silence, we retraced our steps back to the hotel, and I shortly afterward returned to the city. I lost all further knowledge of the two peculiar visitors to my favorite summer resort. The end. Thank you for taking the time to listen along with me this evening. I hope this has helped to relax you and that you have enjoyed the story. If there are any stories you would like to hear in the future, please leave a comment in the section below. And please consider subscribing so that you won't miss out on all the stories coming to the channel very soon. And until next time, goodbye for now.